Hello, I'm Mark. Welcome to Nutmeg. If you had been with me for the last episode, I had still been plotting my way through the Gnostic Gospels. I had actually tried to get through two parts, which was the Song of the Pearl and the Book of Thomas, and I had only successfully navigated my way through the Song of the Pearl. So today I'm going to get through the Book of Thomas, but there's kind of like I'm going to try and tie something current by a current modern thinker with some of this Gnostic thinking. It's partially because I kind of want to present the idea of how long some of these ideas have been around, and how we've considered ourselves. For those that believe in a God, and how we try to approach God, as it were, and how we conceive ourselves in relationship to that pursuit. And part of the reason why I want to present this, not to deviate too far from what I've been going through in the Gnostic Gospels, is because of, again, try to unwrap or unravel some of the facets of how the Gnostics saw themselves in relationships to God, or seemed to see themselves in relationship to God, and how some of our modern themes and some of our modern thoughts, our modern perceptions, aren't necessarily new, springing out of the ether, but have been around for a very long time. So, without making this idea too convoluted or too abstract, I wanted to talk about a person who's current. His name is Dr. Jordan Peterson, and correlate some of his ideas to some of the Gnostic ideas, and I think that are fundamental to discuss in accepting some of the, basically it's in accepting some of the Gnostic principles, or why they could accept some of these principles or the ideas or what they thought Jesus was talking about. And 2,000 years later, I find an author who seems to be talking around some of the same ideas. And I guess it kind of amazes me that these ideas have been around for so long. They may not have been current mainstream, but they've been around for a very, very long time. Again, essentially at its core of how we perceive ourselves. Basically the idea of being worthy of particular things or unworthy, and this springs from our religious belief. Dr. Jordan Peterson is a psychologist out of Toronto, and he's just written a book called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. And he's actually very popular on YouTube right now. He's very controversial. He actually had come into media fame within the past couple of years. One of the things that kind of thrust him into the spotlight was he was against what was called compelled speech in Canada. There was a small group, minority of from the LGBTQ community, transgender to be specific, that were demanding to be called by the preferred pronouns. And Canada was going to write laws of something called a Bill C-16 that was going to make compelled speech mandatory. That if you didn't call a transgender person by their preferred pronouns, that you could be fined and or up to, if you're going to jail if you didn't pay the fines. And Jordan Peterson said that that was infringement on the freedom of speech, and he fought against this compelled speech mandate. But he also had written this book. He's written two books from what I understand so far. One's called Maps of Meaning. The other one is this, the 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. Now, in chapter 2 is actually where I want to focus, because what he says in chapter 2, and more or less it's a self-help book, you know, essentially, basically it's a self-help book for a person to be able to orientate themselves in the world and make steady positive progress. One of the mandates in the book is stand up with your shoulders squared and stand up straight with your shoulders squared and face the world. Some of his ideas are, headings for the different chapters. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping, which is what I'm going to go over today. Make friends with people who want the best for you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. So it's kind of like a self-help book that helps a person with their awareness. It gives them a sense of confidence in how to be able to navigate this very fluctuating, chaotic, confusing world that we live in nowadays. The reason why I picked chapter 2 and drew a comparison or a line between what he was saying in chapter 2 to the Gnosticism is basically the idea about our sense of self. Now, Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, also is religious too. He is a deist. He doesn't believe in a God. And so he's actually done a lot of videos, and he can be checked out. Jordan B. Peterson can be checked out on YouTube, where he's done a lot of videos on the Old Testament, the stories from the Old Testament, but he puts a psychoanalytical slant on it. He's very brilliant. He's very intelligent, and he's worth viewing for those at home that might want to look up Jordan Peterson and some of his work. So that being said, in chapter 2, chapter 2 is treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, the reason why I correlated this to some of the Gnostic concepts was because it addresses how we feel about ourselves. It addresses how we see ourselves and our sense of self-worth and what we think we deserve or what we don't deserve. He says in here something about, he begins it with the idea about people not following through under prescriptions. When a doctor gives them a medication, noncompliance is a big issue for following through on the prescriptions that doctors give. And he takes kind of, as an example, as an into this idea. And he says people don't take care of themselves. People don't follow through with things because for one reason or another, whether it's by laziness or, a lack of self-worth, we don't follow through with taking care of ourselves. And a lot of the times we're better to our pets that we love in following through with taking care of them and taking them to the vet and all the necessary steps than we are in taking care of our own selves. Now, this is significant because as an idea, the basic idea to discuss in the show is the individual, myself, the viewer at home, find ourselves thrust into an environment of fluctuating order and chaos. And this is a big theme for Jordan Peterson because he says that, again, an antidote for chaos. In the four-dimensional plane that we live in, and in our existence, it's a fluctuation between order and chaos. And we have to find our way through that order and chaos. And our sense of self is cultivated in what we think we deserve and what we don't deserve as we navigate our way through this order and chaos, this world we find ourselves in. So, as a basic idea, humans in their totality find themselves in an environment, a four-dimensional plane of fluctuating order and chaos. Now, for those that believe in a deity, for those that believe in a God, we're trying to make sense of this order and chaos we find ourselves in. A large part of it is suffering. Why in this four-dimensional plane? Like one of the big questions is, if God was all love in totality, why do we live in a world where we suffer? It's a very, very old question that theologians and lay people of all stripe across all cultures and societies have been asking for as long as we've been able to conceptualize the idea, if one believes in a God. I'm setting aside those that may have an agnostic or atheistic perspective, not disrespectfully, but just saying, for those that believe in a God, one of the challenges we have is being able to come to terms with a deity that may have created the universe while suffering exists inside of the universe that was created, and why we have to experience it. And that suffering springs from this order and chaos. So, and we try to make sense of it. Now, for somebody like myself, I've come to terms with, it's occurred to me, and even like Jordan Peterson and other people, the Bible isn't necessarily just a chronological order of the history of the Jewish people. In a lot of ways, it's a metaphoric or allegoric, in its very rich in this, example of people contending with God. Or, to put it in another term, people contending with nature itself, the apparent order and chaos that we find ourselves thrust into. As I've said before on previous shows, in a lot of ways, the Bible, in what it's trying to relate on a very deep level to the reader, is examples, wide and varied examples of how humanity, on an individual level, deals with this chaos that we find ourselves thrust into. And how we come to terms with it, or how we don't come to terms with it, or how it might wreck us, or how it might make us stronger, what it does to our sense of self, or what we deserve and what we think we don't deserve. So, and a big part of it is, again, is addressing the suffering that the apparent suffering we find ourselves thrust into. Now, and as I said, in one of the stories in the Old Testament of Jacob, when he wrestled with the angel, when Jacob wrestled with the angel, and his name was changed to Israel, which means one who contends with God. And, to pause again for a moment to explore the richness of that, of the content of that, just one saying, one who contends with God. Contention with God is contention with nature and existence, and why things happen as they do, and why we suffer. Jacob wrestled and his name was changed to Israel, one who contends with God, because a big part of the human experience, especially for those who believe in a God, is contending with God. Now, for the Jewish people, there's an overt encouragement to contend with God, because there's negative connotations that go along with this idea of contending with God, like how dare you, lowly human, contend with a God. But it's how we grow. It's how we come to terms with the existence we find ourselves thrust into. And different religions and factions that come up with ways to find an in into this contention, or to coming to terms with the deity that created the universe and the existence that we find ourselves in. Now, the Gnostic solution for this contending is gnosis. And if I hadn't done a good enough job of breaking down the idea of gnosis and the idea of knowing, it's a progressive understanding of how the machine works. And I put it in this term of how the machine works, and I'm saying in totality the idea of just nature itself, the warp and woof of the existence that we move through. Night and day, the changing of the seasons, birth and maturation, degeneration and death, people and how we interact with each other, how one animal has to die so that another animal can live because we consume it, or other animals consume it. There's a multitude of different components that make up this existence we find ourselves thrust into. And as a direct result, we find that we contend with God because there's many aspects of this finite existence we find ourselves in that we don't agree with. Now, what's interesting about that, and what Jordan Peterson is kind of like spoken about and kind of unpacked in chapter 2, because he's somebody who has a religious background, believes in a deity, and he has a psychological bent, a psychoanalytical bent to it. And it's actually a really big subject, so I have to finally pick an in for it. And it goes back to Jesus, and he's actually got it in here. He's got why Jesus would make a statement like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Or because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Now, for the orthodoxy, the Orthodox Christian Church, Jesus is making a statement of uniqueness, and the fact that only through him can one get to heaven. And he is the narrow gate. So this personification of Jesus as being the one to get to God through that act of sacrificial grace is the way to get to heaven. That's the Orthodox view of how they unpack this and made sense of how one approaches deity in the contending and accepting it. But this is based upon a couple of basic assumptions. One is the idea that humans are unworthy, or humans fall short, and Jesus was the first to not fall short. And because we are full of sin, as it were, that word is interpreted, we don't deserve to move towards deity. We don't deserve to be with God and in heaven and all those different things. We all deserve to go to hell. I mean, these are basic premises to fundamental Christianity. And only the blood of Jesus washes away this taint of unworthiness that keeps us from being capable of getting to God, because ultimately we all deserve to go to hell. This is, in a lot of ways, a fear-based religion, and it's at the core of the belief. Now, the Gnostic in for the solution in contending with God is, of course, gnosis. So when they read something like, I am the way and the truth and the life, because straight is the gate and narrow is the way, he's speaking of a pathway, not a personification. Jesus is speaking of an idea of, to the Gnostics, an internalization. When the Gnostics heard what Jesus was saying, to them they interpreted Jesus saying that through a progressive study, a progressive understanding of how life works, it's kind of like a concentric ring that keeps getting bigger and bigger. If my level of awareness is inside of this circle here, the more gnosis I absorb, the bigger the circle gets. That's the active, dynamic function of acquiring the gnosis. It's kind of like the old saying of the flapping of a butterfly's wings in North America is a typhoon in India or a hurricane in India. That in that little saying, it's an understanding of process, a natural process, that the flapping of the small wings, creating a small, almost unnoticeable turbulence of air, can generate over time from one place to another something as large and destructive as a hurricane. But we as humans, when we find ourselves thrust into this environment, only understand existence inside of a particular circle of experience and awareness. The problem is, once there's a circle created of awareness for the individual person, there's an inside within the perimeter, there's an outside. For the Gnostics, the gnosis process caused one to have an ever-expanding level of awareness to understand the warp and woof of function of the universe, of how it worked and why it worked, and how all these things came together beautifully to create a balance of life, a balance of existence, a balance between what Jordan Peterson called, he had taken actually the yin-yang symbol in his book. And he talked about the idea that in the yin-yang symbol, we have yin, which is the darkness and the feminine, and at its core you have the yang, which is the masculine. And in the other side, which is yang, which is the masculine and the light, at its core you had yin at its center. It's the yin-yang symbol that most people are familiar with. Well, Jordan Peterson had pointed out that one side is order and the other side is chaos, and the line between the two is actually the line, the very fine line and difficult line that every human has to learn how to navigate, balancing between chaos and order. Because we find ourselves always, myself and any other person, the viewer at home, any person, constantly balancing between order and chaos. And this order and chaos we find ourselves fluctuating in, as I had just previously stated, shapes our self-perception. We come to terms with our existence, and in some ways, not to put the cart before the horse, ideologically, with, say, for instance, the particular organized religions. I would and probably very controversially say that this idea of, let's say, Jesus dying for our sins because we're unworthy, in some ways, societally and culturally, and how we're raised and how we feel about ourselves, in some ways, that idea is a perfect fit for how we felt about ourselves anyways. You know, these two things seem to work in tandem to each other. And in some ways, we accept our religious beliefs because they appeal to where we are in our self-perception. You know, to wholly accept the fact that Jesus is a personal savior, sometimes, you know, because he died for our sins and one is unworthy and worthy of hell, sometimes speaks more to how the person feels about themselves and their sense of self-worth than any objective truth that exists. And I know that might sound a little abstract, but I think it's true nevertheless, and it's very poignant. The religious idea sprung from the culture's sense of self or sense of identity. The version of Jesus dying on the cross for everyone's sins and its acceptance to varying degrees of a billion people, whatever it is, whether through Catholicism or Protestantism or all these different avenues and subdivisions, in some ways is a byproduct of or a direct correlation to the individual people that make up the society and the culture's sense of themselves. And it's significant to point that out because as I've expounded upon the Gnostic idea in the book, that I've tried to present the idea that within Gnosticism there's a sense that one can gain gnosis and one can have an ever-expanding circumference of awareness and grow and grow and grow to what is called the Christ consciousness or being able to cleave to God again, requires a sense and an understanding that you deserve to have these things, that you're worthy to have these particular things. It's a necessary precursor to the Gnostic process. If you don't believe that your level of self-worth is such that you deserve to gain gnosis and gain a level of awareness, first with the environment that you find yourself in, and by contending with God, by asking God questions, by sometimes shaking your fist angrily at the sky and saying, why does this happen? And I'm pissed because this person that I love left me, or I was mistreated by this person, or there's suffering in the world, or we have pain. We grow in our Gnostic understanding by contending with God. In some ways, it's completely interwoven into the narrative of the Old Testament. And Jesus, in some ways, for those that take a mystical perspective, actually represents the apex of that wrestling with God, to where for some, in a mystical perspective, Jesus was the first to finally overcome this contending, to finally come to a point of contention with God to cleaving with God. And all the characters before him, from the Bible, woven from the Genesis narrative in Adam and Eve all the way forward to him, represent those struggling at varying levels in contention with God. But one thing that they have in common to varying degrees is a sense of worth of being able to contend with God. And Jordan Peterson is putting out in his book that you have to look at yourself like you're worthy. You have to look at yourself like you're worth contending with God. Well, that's those are the terms that I kind of added to it. And it's important in some ways that I kind of expound upon this idea of self-worth, because he goes into it to varying degrees, and as I said, because of his religious belief or spiritual background, and the fact that he deconstructed some of the stories from the Old Testament, and in this chapter in particular, chapter 2, he goes into details of some of the characters and the allegoric content in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. For instance, he was saying that the snake in the Garden of Eden was also Satan, or the spirit of evil itself. And the importance of the symbolic identification is staggeringly brilliant. The worst of all, and this is actually, he's got this italicized because of how significant it is. Quoting from his book, the worst of all possible snakes is the eternal human proclivity for evil. The worst of all possible snakes is psychological, spiritual, personal, internal. No walls, however tall, will keep them out. Now, he's expounding upon the idea about how the Garden of Eden was supposed to be an enclosed place of safety. But for one reason or another, even though it was an enclosed place of safety, a snake was still able to get into it. Now, when a person deconstructs this idea psychoanalytically and applies it to the individual person, no matter how much we try to protect ourselves from evil, like say for instance a parent's trying to protect a child from the danger of alcohol and pornography and drugs, stuff like that, the world will still, the snake will still filter in. And there's no other way that we can protect ourselves from these things that we have to experience so that we can grow as people. And we will reach those points when we have these experiences where we will contend with God. But these are necessary steps for us to be able to grow. Now, he said that the worst of all possible snakes is the eternal human proclivity for evil. Self-perception again. When we look at ourselves and we realize that humans amongst all other animals have, above all animals, have the proclivity to do evil, to be cruel and inhuman and cause others to suffer and be malevolent, These are the characteristics that we recognize in ourselves that makes us say we are not worthy. Because humans have this proclivity, we have this potentiality for these destructive things. Now, and again, this is something for another show, but let's say, for instance, the idea of Satan, or the Luciferian idea. For the orthodoxy, this idea is from almost with a schizophrenic effect, as I mentioned in other shows. It's disassociated from the self. This Luciferian or Satan idea is disassociated and personified as an external force. To varying degrees throughout history, as this character from the Bible has been expounded upon, and its earliest description was called the adversary. And it's first mentioned in the Bible, the Satan character was called the adversary, but it wasn't necessarily so personified. Jordan Peterson is more or less weaving into the narrative the idea that the worst of all possible snakes is inside of every person. This Satan aspect, this evil spirit, is not an external personification, because actually that's a protective mechanism. We protect ourselves and our totality by externalizing that evil, by saying that it exists out there and it's personified in this creature that's waiting around the corner, trying to push us away from God. Part of the Gnostic process of the acceptance of worthiness, and again, I know this is very controversial, is the acceptance of that potential for evil inside of every person. The worst of all possible snakes is the eternal human proclivity for evil. The snake exists inside of every person. The Garden of Eden is an allegory for some aspect of the human experience. Adam and Eve are some allegory for some aspect of the individual human experience. And also the snake, the human proclivity for evil. But because we recognize that proclivity for evil inside of ourselves, we either externalized it and said that it was a factor outside of us and not self, or said it makes us unworthy because we have potential for evil and we sin, which again, as I said, how that word is defined. Sin from the orthodoxy had come to mean deficient, where for the Gnostic it meant to miss the mark, to miss the target that you're aiming at. A necessary part to the Gnostic process of being able to grow, to be able to integrate, is the acceptance that we all have the proclivity for evil inside of us. But that's half of it. It's the shadow self that's been talked about in Native American Toltec shamanism. And it's been exemplified in some Hindu philosophy with the idea of the different deities that are actually parts of self. Jordan Peterson puts a quote in here from a Russian writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, where he had written that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And again, that's very significant because it's saying that there is no externalization of the factor. There's an acceptance that inside of every person, again, there's a potential for this ultimate evil. But there's a choice, because on one side there's that potential for evil, but there's also that potential for the light half, the Messiah part of every person. So there's a dilemma. If we have this a line cutting of good and evil cutting directly through the heart of every human, as an oversimplification, and I know, and I don't mean to just like generalize so that we cut out all the nuance of the ideas. In some ways, personally, the best example for me of what to do with that dilemma, the realization that it cuts through the heart of every person, so that we have a proclivity for evil or ultimate good. How do we rectify that? And it's in the old Native American saying about the two wolves inside of every person. And as the saying goes, that there are two wolves inside of every person. One wolf of light and one wolf of darkness. One wolf of good and one wolf of evil. Which of the two wolves will survive inside of the person? And the answer is the one you feed more. This is kind of a quasi-description of the Gnostic process. If there's an integration and an understanding that inside of us we have that ability to be either that evil or that good, we have the choice. We have the choice to feed one or feed the other. For the Gnostics, you feed the good. You feed the Christ aspect. You feed the part that is inherently divine or has a spark of the divine inside of it with gnosis, with an ever-growing circumference of understanding that radiates out more and more and more the more a person grows. It's like moving through a field. We move closer to God or we move farther away from God, contingent on what our choices are. But as I said, for the Gnostics, the idea of that choice of which one you feed, and gnosis being the key to feeding the light half, it can be speculated, and I know there's speculation on my part, that for the orthodoxy, this recognition of evil and humans' proclivity for evil kind of stamped a condemnation upon them and said, there is not that worthiness. We're not worthy to be able to accept God. We're not worthy to be able to move towards God. We deserve to go to hell because we can be inherently evil. We do inherently evil things. And then, of course, that word sin that goes along with it. So there's got to be another solution. So the solution became the sacrificial lamb. This proclivity for evil was like the stain, the taint, the scarlet letter. It could not be removed in any way, shape, or form. And even some of the early church fathers said that you couldn't, as they were saying that the Gnostics were heretics, you could not absorb wisdom and understanding to get to God. We were inherently deficient, and it was a bar or a barrier that could not be removed. So the way, and Jesus, again, I am the truth, the light, and the way, interpreted two different ways. For the orthodoxy, the interpretation of I am the truth, the light, and the way meant that because the bar could not be removed, and gnosis was not the key to getting to heaven, or being able to become conscious of the Christ aspect and cleaving to God, the way must be a sacrificial offering that would remove that taint in a supernatural way so that the barrier to heaven would be lifted. So that these unworthy, sniveling, shriveled entities that are humans in their miserable existence, falling far beneath the bar of acceptance in the eyes of God, could now be elevated to being accepted by God because this man had hung upon a cross and shed his blood for the taint of the original human sin. So these are, again, very distinctively different takes on the human experience when one believes in God. And I believe it springs from our sense of how we feel about ourselves and what we think we deserve. And Jordan Peterson, in his book, written in, I don't know, perhaps 2016, over a period of I don't know how many years, whatever it was, is expounding upon this very idea that mankind in some ways, and as an expression of our religious belief, and again, this is partially Jordan Peterson and partially what I'm getting from what I think he's saying, we think we don't deserve God. We think that in this suffering and in this contention with God, we don't deserve to cleave to God. We don't deserve to move towards God. So if you don't believe you deserve to move towards God, then the Gnostic concept would be rejected. And if you didn't have a strong enough sense of self-worth, then the Gnostic process would be useless to you. And even today, as I sit here in the studio taping the show to an audience, there may be an X amount of people who have watched the show and may pick up the Gnostic gospel, and they'll have varying degrees of understanding of acceptance of it. And I think it's contingent again on our level of self-worth, our level of what we think we deserve to understand, or we deserve to grasp in relation to this deity, this God, this great mind, this great spirit that created the universe. And Jordan Peterson points out that it springs from our sense of nakedness, and unworthiness, and our faults, and all these things stood out. And actually, it's very interesting because he actually goes into detail in explanation from the book in Genesis in the Garden of Eden when they ate from the tree, what the apple represents, and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And also this interweaves very nicely with the contention narrative from the Old Testament too, all the way up through Jacob, as I mentioned previously on the show. as he expounds upon the idea of the narrative where Eve eats from the tree, the snake talks to Eve and says, if you eat from this tree, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And Jordan Peterson actually points out that it's interesting that the snake had pointed out that only one thing that would make her like God, eating from the tree, which is knowing good and evil. And again, this is where it gets very interesting because, and I said it on previous shows before, and as Jordan Peterson points out, when it says they ate from the tree, their eyes are opened. And to point out again, what's the first thing that happened when Adam and Eve ate from the tree and their eyes were open? They discovered they were naked. That represents, and I'm not saying that again, you know, just to put the statement on the table, that the Genesis narrative is literal history. I believe it's an allegory for the human condition. And the masters, the writers that wrote these particular stories are pointing out aspects of the human condition. When they discovered they were naked, it represents the first value judgment that humans perceived. Knowledge of good and evil. And what did they do? They evaluated it. When they discovered they were naked, they evaluated it and they didn't like it. So they covered themselves up. It's a representation of the first human value judgment. Knowledge of good and evil. And you know, Jordan Peterson expounds upon the idea about what naked means as you're trying to unlock the mysteries of, like, you know, what some of these things, as they were written, what they also might mean allegorically, metaphorically. Naked means vulnerable and easily damaged. Naked means subject to judgment. Naked means unprotected and unarmed in a jungle of nature and man. This is why Adam and Eve became ashamed immediately after their eyes are opened. They could see, and what they saw was themselves. Their faults stood out. They felt unworthy to stand before God. So, and again, the metaphoric richness here is just, it's incredible. The allegoric story of the Garden of Eden and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a representation of, and just to try and put a little bow on it, when humanity was naked before God, or they discovered they were naked and they did the first value judgment, from then on was contention with God, all the way up through Jesus and forward. Every one of the characters in the Bible is contending with God in certain aspects, whether it's Jonah in the belly of the whale, or Moses and why he was picked to do what he was supposed to do, or Jacob wrestling with the angel, or Abraham told to sacrifice his son. All the different suffering and the different facets and aspects of our lives, this contending with God springs from our knowledge of good and evil. This is why that idea of one shaking their fist at the sky, saying to God, this isn't fair. We know that it's not a literal historic story, the idea of Genesis, but the brilliance of the story is it's conceptualizing and putting into story form an aspect of the human condition. We evaluate the four-dimensional plane that we live in, the order and chaos, and we judge it. We say this is good, this is evil, this is fair, this is unfair, and you look for an author of this, what is fair and unfair. And for those who believe in a God, of course, it is God. So we contend with God about it. We get angry with God. We get pissed with God. We tell God that that's not fair. We shake our fist at God. And that's part of it. But the other part of it is for the external. For the internal, we see all the faults inside of ourselves. And the nakedness. And we feel unworthy. So it's kind of like two aspects of it. One is contending, which in a lot of ways, when you get the answers, you move progressively towards God. Jesus actually representing the apex of that. But for the layperson, myself or any other person who hasn't reached that Christ-level consciousness, this sense of unworthiness before God, because I evaluate myself, because I judge myself. And we live in a world where, with mass media and the advent of the internet, there's constant judgment going on. Politically, the Democrats and Republicans, President Trump being in office, and the media slamming him at every turn about what a bad president he is and all those different aspects. Apolitical on the whole point, so I'm not actually taking a side. I'm just mentioning what I see. In the 21st century that we find ourselves in, much hasn't changed about the idea of this judgment. this evaluation, this knowledge of good and evil, and how it shapes our external worldview and also how it shapes our internal view. For what Jordan Peterson is expounding upon, and what I'm trying to say that the Gnostics should overcome to accept the idea that one can be worthy to move towards God, is a sense of getting beyond feeling unworthy because we've seen all of our faults looking at ourselves when we internalized the process and said, it's part of our nature, it's part of what we're created to do, and it does not make me invalid. It doesn't make me any less. It doesn't diminish me as a person. It doesn't diminish who I am and my sense of the direction I'm moving in. And that's a significant difference between the Orthodox takes of being diminished and unworthy, and the Gnostic takes of, no, I'm not diminished, and I am worthy of this particular thing. And yes, I have made mistakes, but I will make amends for them as best I can, but I'll continue to move forward because I wish to achieve the Christ level of consciousness. So, for even, and this is the thing, even in our contemporary time, 2018, it's the current year, myself or the viewer at home or any other person has to reach that developmental point of self-acceptance. That, pointing out, is an old dilemma, as old as many of some of our oldest concepts going back through the Gnostic process. I was just putting out in this Gnostic process what it appears to me what had to be overcome internally in the self before one could begin a Gnostic process. You had to think you were worthy to be able to begin this process. But if you didn't think you were worthy, then again, the Gnostic process would be meaningless to you or anyone else, because you wouldn't think that you deserved gnosis to be able to grow into understanding God. And for the Gnostics, they believe that Jesus, in all of his points, was expounding upon the idea that, yes, you are. Jesus said, does it not say that if you understand these teachings, you'll have more power than I have, or the same power I have, if not more? Does it not say, ye are gods? Who are my mothers and my brothers and my sisters? Anyone that understands and lives out and acts out the word of the Father. Jesus himself expounded upon the idea that every individual is worthy to move towards this particular goal, a princehood, as it were, assuming a throne, a reluctance to assume a throne. For the Gnostics, everything that Jesus said you're worthy. And even the idea of sin, because all fall short in the sin and stuff like that. But when you put it in the context of how sin was defined for their terms in comparison to the Orthodoxy, it does nothing to diminish the essential nature of worthiness inside the individual person. Every person is not diminished because of this sin. We sink into confusion, the fear and terror and the fog of this confusion, but it doesn't diminish our capacity to be able to grow in the Gnostic process. And this is what Jordan Peterson seems to be pointing out, and I'm kind of like superimposing or supplanting upon what I'm perceiving as the Gnostic process and how they perceive what Jesus was teaching 2,000 years ago. And the idea, like for the Gnostics, that heaven was a state of mind, a state of presence, as was hell. So it wasn't something that you were going to go to at the end of life as an ultimate reward or punishment. Jordan Peterson actually says, a quote here, perhaps heaven is something you must build, and immortality is something you must earn. So this idea of building or earning is a progressive effort, a progressive endeavor that over time grows. It's not something where one magically snaps their fingers and they've crossed a threshold of being unsaved and then saved as accepting Jesus as personal Savior. The process for the individual person as they walk through their lives, for the Gnostics, and this growth in wisdom was progressive, and it built upon itself. For every little bit of wisdom one acquired, more was given. And then after that, more was built upon that, and then more was built upon that, and then more was built upon that. And before one knew it, after a while, they had achieved varying degrees of the Christ consciousness moving forward. But the problem is, in some ways too, we also punish ourselves for all our failings. When we fail, when we're human, when we fall, when we stumble, when we've succumb to the human proclivity for evil and how we could make each other suffer and selfishness and indifference, it's easy to assign that as an essential part of nature, of the nature of the individual person. When a person is selfish, when a person is judgmental, when a person is indifferent to the suffering of others, it's a moment of weakness, not an indicator of the character. Yes, we have the potential to do these particular evil things, but it in no ways diminishes the potential of the divine spark that's supposed to be inherent inside of every human. And it's important that significator, if that's actually a word, is actually pointed out, because it's an association. For the Orthodox, the proof in the pudding for the Orthodox is, have you sinned? Have you fallen short? Have you stolen? Have you lied? Well, that's proof that you're failed, that you're flawed, that the movable bar is there. For the Gnostics, that wasn't proof of anything. That was proof of our humanity. That was a proof of the fact that we have the ability to do these particular things, but we also inherited the divine spark. And we make the choice to move away from that indifference and that cruelty and that suffering and that proclivity for evil inside of ourselves, that shadow part of ourselves, and feed the light part. And you feed the light part with gnosis. And when you feed it with gnosis, you grow. Exponentially, you grow. But you have to believe you deserve it. Every person has to believe they deserve it. And Jordan Peterson points out, too, about predators. Dogs and cats are predators, like a dog will kill to eat, or a cat will. But that's part of their nature. It's not because they're evil. It's because it's an essential part of their nature. So they don't bear any responsibility for it. They're hungry, not evil. But humans are different. Predators have no, and I quote here, predators have no comprehension of the fundamental weakness as humans do. And this is what he pointed out. Because humans can perceive weakness in ourselves and in others, we know we manipulate it. And that's the essence of the evil, or part of the evil, the proclivity for evil. Because we perceive weakness in ourselves and in others, we will sometimes use it against that weakness against others so we can manipulate them to get things to work in our own favor. And this, a lot of our suffering through history has sprung from this understanding of this weakness, of this knowledge of good and evil, and the weakness inside of ourselves and others. We comprehend fundamental weakness, fundamental vulnerability, and our own subjugation to death and pain. We don't know if animals know about death or what the threshold for pain is, but humans can perceive these things. And we can also subjugate others with our perception of these things. And this is, again, what the root of what he's saying is, from where the evil springs. But we do not know exactly how and where we can be hurt and why. That is as good a definition as any of self-consciousness. We are aware of our own defenselessness, finitude, and mortality. We can feel pain and self-disgust and shame and horror, and we know it. And we know that makes us suffer. We know how dread and pain can be inflicted on us, and that means we know exactly how to inflict it on others. We know how we are naked and how that nakedness can be exploited. And that means we know how others are naked and how they can be exploited. Now, that is pretty, basic in the explanation. But another part of it is, with this idea of self-consciousness and pain and suffering and self-disgust, it's also, I think in a lot of ways, the root of contention. Once we were self-conscious about suffering, and knowing the difference between the pain and suffering and how it could be applied or how we experience it, it's also the root of why we started contending with God. Self-consciousness comes with the baggage of the realization that we suffer. And again, I'm reiterating. But because we know we suffer, we question why we have to. And therein lies the contention. We're in an environment where part of existence in that environment means suffering. And because we have our eyes open to the knowledge of good and evil, and we're conscious, we ask fundamental questions. One of them is, why? That sucks. That hurts. Why do I have to feel it? Why do I have to go through it? That's not fair. That's a basic part of our contending in our wrestling with God. And it's something that every individual person in their own time, in their own Gnostic process, has to overcome and come to terms with. Jesus had laid out a pathway of that contention, moving all the way up through to reach this level of cleaving to God again. And when he says, I'm the truth, the light, the way, the narrow gate, every person is a narrow gate. My narrow gate is myself. The viewer at home, your narrow gate is yourself. And what you're willing to contend with inside of yourself when you contend with God over the nature of existence and why you suffer. That's the nuts and bolts part of the Gnostic process. And he goes into the idea of original sin again. And again, for the orthodoxy, the original sin was just gaining the knowledge of good and evil is what made us inherently flawed. It seems to me that this original sin is no more than the demarcation of the beginning of a pathway. It's kind of like having to come full circle. This eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is kind of like X marks the spot of where humanity has to begin. We're self-conscious. Now, to try and put it in a four-dimensional perspective, not linearly necessarily, but circular. The idea is if we begun at a certain point and we're self-conscious and we realize good and evil and all these different facets of it, then what we're trying to do is work our way back home. We have to come to terms with all these aspects of creation to raise to a certain level of consciousness, the Christ consciousness as it were, before we could come back home again from where we started. For the Gnostics, this is the pathway. This is the path that has to be trod if we want to get back to God, if we want to get back home again to Eden. But it's kind of like God was saying to humanity when we ate from this tree, be careful what you ask for. I love you so much, I'll give it to you. I'll let you eat from this tree, and I'll let you have this fallen nature into this four-dimensional place. But you're going to suffer for it. And if you really want this, if you really want to understand the nature of good and evil, I'll let you have it. But you're going to suffer to understand it. And I know that that's a very take on the idea of God's character, because God, for some that detract from, are skeptical of the story, an atheistic perspective, God is this mean, vengeful prick who just wants to stomp on Adam and Eve for what they did, punish them for violating the law. But there's another aspect to it too that says God, being the merciful, all-knowing God that God is, says, all right, you ate from this tree, you did something that you weren't supposed to do because in some ways you weren't mature enough to navigate it. But I love you, and I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to let you follow this pathway. And it's destructive, and it's dangerous, and it's full of suffering, but you asked for it. I love you. I'm going to let you do it. And every human has to find a way back home from that starting point of self-consciousness. And we have to work our way through our sense of self, how we perceive others, what we think evil and good is, and where it exists, outside of us or inside of us. And that is how we'll get back from the original sin, back to God. So, you know, again, as I said, he goes into great detail about the idea that we have the potential inside of us. We have the spark of the divine inside ourselves. It's our willingness to accept that spark of the divine that moves us back. That is the potentiality. It's the spark. It's the lighting of the fuse. But unless one accepts that they are worthy, then, as I said, Gnosticism is useless to the individual person, and orthodoxy and the idea that we're inherently flawed would be a better fit for a person. But, and I'll leave it on this. We actually didn't get into the Gospel of Thomas, as I said, I got sidetracked by this wonderful book by Jordan Peterson in chapter 2. It's significant to point that out and to ask yourselves, you know, does my religious belief and my sense of what I think is objective reality, a direct byproduct more of how I feel about myself and how it fits and conforms to my sense of self than something that is objectively going to move me towards this elevated state of wisdom or understanding? Just because one believes, controversially enough, you know, I mean, inflammatory enough to put the statement on the table, just because a person from an Orthodox perspective, be they Muslim or Christian or any other sub-denomination of these belief systems in relation to God, believe that we're inherently flawed and the bar is fixed in place so that it is insurmountable and we always fall short of the glory of God, as it were, and don't deserve to move back towards Him. Just because you believe that that is your reality does not necessarily make it objective reality. because the Gnostics have proved that they have just a compelling reality that has everything to do with human sense of self-worth and their ability to be able to move towards God and cleave towards God again, because there is a wholesale acceptance of the idea of the inherent divine spark inside of every person. So please, I ask the viewer at home to forgive me for going kind of like being sidetracked from the Gnostic Gospels. It's just as I had read Jordan Peterson's book, I found that this chapter, amongst others, actually dovetailed very nicely into some of the Gnostic concepts that I'd be expounding upon. And just to close with the idea that it's not necessarily Gnostics alone exclusively. There are many different studies, pathways one could take, whether it's Buddhism or Native American shamanism or the Gnostic Gospels, that in a lot of ways accept this very basic component of the human condition, worthiness, the sense of self-worth that says that I can become enlightened, I can obtain the Christ consciousness, I can move towards God, I can achieve nirvana, I can become one with the Tao. I can, from a Native American perspective, I can make an ally of the parasite and become a Nagual. One of the things, amongst others, that all these different teachings have in common is an acceptance of individual self-worth. And I'd like to leave, the viewer at home with that. Question what your sense of self-worth is. Do you think that you're worthy of cleaving to God, moving towards God, or you think that you're unworthy? Because it's not myself, Mark Power, in 2018, again, the current year, asking this question anew, provocatively, like it's never been asked before. This question has been around for a very, very, very long time, and we've had varying degrees of success with being able to answer it. I'm Mark Power. I'd like to thank you again for joining me for another episode of Nate Sutan. I hope you'll join me again as I'll go into the Gospel of Thomas. Thank you again, and have a good night.